Stay hungry, stay foolish.
Now on the Innovation Show, we welcome Andrew Melchior, CEO and founder of Third Space agency, thirdspace.co. Welcome to the show, Andrew.
Pleasure to be here, Aidan.
We were having a chat, and I was telling you that I did my research on you and your background. I always found it so interesting that when you look at people who are succeeding in the world today, that they're multi-disciplined or multi-experienced in different realms and different places. And you have that in that you're a musician, a technologist, but you've brought all those different collected dots and connected them in a really interesting way. So it's great to talk to you, and I'd love to hear your background.
Well, thanks, Aidan. I think it's a particular kind of ADHD has brought me here. It started a while ago. I mean, I was born in West Germany. My mother used to work for the armed forces over there, and she settled down with a German guy, my dad, and very early on, I was into music. My grandfather on my German side played me very early on his record collection, these amazing Deutsche Grammophon albums of things like Carry On, conducting Beethoven. And I remember at that time being first aware of abstract thought. Music was the first thing that really gave me abstract thought. So pedaled through my teens, became a keyboard player, pianist, was classically trained. I worked with a bunch of bands, including a band called Elbow, who are quite well known these days, in my early days. And then one way or another, I managed to find myself at the cusp of this internet revolution that happened in the 90s. Right place, right time. And I was sat at Manchester University wondering what to do. And Tim Berners-Lee had the good taste to invent the World Wide Web. So I sat on the computers at Manchester University and figured out a few things about what I wanted to do next. And I was also experimenting building computers because I was in the studio environment and people were just starting to record using MIDI and digital recording devices. So all these things kind of converged, and one way or another, it was kind of like a lucky man, really. I ended up in London working for EMI Records. They were in desperate need of people who could understand this new medium, and so they rolled me and a bunch of my friends out in front of people like Radiohead and Coldplay and David Bowie, and we were the guys and the girls who were basically there to do the thing that was the internet, which was a good opportunity, really. My first real salvo into multimedia, because we got to do a bunch of new things for the first time, like streaming videos, understanding what digital music was going to be in the future, and trying to figure out how to work with things like mobile phones. One of the first real mobile phone downloads opportunities was with Bowie. He was one of the first artists to do a polyphonic ringtone, and we worked together to basically promote a bunch of his ideas in mobile space as well as web space.
Brilliant. And were those ideas coming as a kind of a collaboration between you and the artist, or were you guys coming up with the ideas, bringing them to the artist?
I think a bit of both, because especially artists like David Bowie is very generous with creativity. He was a technocrat, and he loved technology. He loved his Apple Mac, and he loved making music with electronics. But he was also a promoter of people with ideas, because I think he was keen for an eye for the main opportunity. And I think when I was just in my mid-20s, I was just sat there and I was so inspired by the chance of actually being able to work with him. And I just used to rattle off these mad emails about what we could do, what we could try, and he would come back and go, yes, we could try that, or no, definitely don't do that, and it was, so there was some dynamism there. And I think the labels at the time were all sort of swamped with this idea of the threat of the internet, a bit like these days as a threat of AI. But really, I always felt these things were an opportunity, not a threat.
You mentioned Radiohead as well, David, and they always struck me as a band who were trying new things and tinkering with technology. And it came across in their music and their live sets. But did you see that from them from an early stage? They
would do cute things like glue the headphones into new Sony MP3 players and then give them to journalists to listen to try and avoid piracy and cute stuff like that. They were into hacking. I remember really early on that they just seemed to want to hack things. And the idea of a playback party turned into this bizarre scenario where you handed out these players that were super glued together with the headphones because nobody would then be able to copy the audio.
Brilliant.
So it was cute. I think going back to that with Bowie, we did a bunch of things for the first time together, like digital cinema. He was one of the first artists to do a live simultaneous broadcast in 5.1 stereo from the old Riverside Studios in London, and we set that up with the Odeon Cinema and Regal Cinemas in North America, and you were able to rock up to the cinema, and you sat in front of the screen, and there was Mr. Bowie playing a bunch of songs live, larger than you like. And he was one of the first artists really to play with that as a medium, which has now turned into this operatic and theatrical thing at cinemas. But he was one of the first to do it with contemporary music.
Yeah, and you made a huge jump then as well. I mean, obviously you were born into the technology, and you grew as it grew. And I was thinking about this. I was thinking how artists struggle to make money from actual music sales, from product sales, essentially now, and that they've gone very wide on experience, and that you have absolutely nailed it with some of those experiences with the artists you're working with, like Bjork at the moment.
Well, I think the idea of presence is important, and I think this is, we can leap around, but the idea of where you are when you play music. I was always fascinated by, when I was a kid playing piano music, when I played sheet music and I was playing Beethoven or Mozart or something, I used to be fascinated by this idea that they were still in the room with me. So there was this part of their brain that had been dead their biological body been dead for 200 to 300 years. But these dots on paper, this mechanical reproduction of some form of their music, meant that you could almost manifest them in the room with you while playing the piano. And I think that's really interesting, because this conceptual idea of spaces and third spaces and fourth spaces and the things that we can talk about. Where are you? Where are we right now? We're on this digital medium and we're having a conversation, but there's this intermediate layer, and where you are when that is happening is very interesting. And the modern era and what Bjork is doing, and a bunch of artists play around with broadcast tech, is really challenging our perceptions of what presence is and what it is to be present, and how are you present? Is it physicality? Is it your intellectual being making sounds? And so I think we are, and especially now in this new holographic medium, new augmented realities and virtual realities that are being experimented with, they're putting us all in these new wrappers of, well, what does it mean to be present? What am I really doing? Beyond the eyes and the ears, how are we communing in this kind of electrically powered sort of other space? Yeah,
and it really gives you an opportunity to, like, I was going to say touch the flesh, but touch the virtual flesh, in that, like, I love this idea. These platforms where you can collaborate with different artists together and create a track or whatever. Yeah. But this is almost getting, you will have Bjork standing beside you doing a vocal or whatever. There's a real leap towards this kind of world where it's actually the artist is coming to you rather than you have to go to the event. And artists like Bjork, and I know we'll talk about Massive Attack in a few minutes, but those kind of artists are working with you to create those experiences. My role has always seemed to have been to join the dots between creative minds and scientific minds. I think from being a child and having to learn German and English and translate for my grandparents, who were sat in the same room, I realized my role seems to be, in a lot of ways, is to facilitate a dialogue between these different sides of the brain with other people. And I think to manifest Bjork's vision into VR, to be able to understand how a performer wants to connect with his audience or her audience is the kind of goal, and then being able to translate those creative and sort of esoteric ideas into a technical execution is the bit that I get excited about, where I join the dots when I can. Bjork was very interesting just because of the way of being able to communicate with her fans, and we've had extraordinary feedback from people when this touring show, this Bjork Digital show, where people have come out of the VR experience and gone, "Oh my God, it's like FaceTiming Bjork," and then we've gone one layer even further, and we've created these volumetric models of her, these 3D depth-based models of her, and in those experiences, which are the kind of more advanced VR versions of playback, they're able to stand and walk around her, and for a very private and very shy artist, she's not, she's definitely not in your face when you meet her as a person. It's interesting to be able to create this connection for her fans. Obviously, it doesn't run both ways at the moment. This is the interesting that I think will come next. And this is one thing Bowie said as well, which he thought the internet was amazing, because for years he'd be doing one to many. He'd be playing a gig and it was me to playing to everyone. And then suddenly the internet allowed you to do one to one.
and have that relationship. I think what will come next, and will be very interesting for artists, will be how they will be able to, in some ways, transmit themselves maybe as much into your front room as they're transmitting themselves through the front of a stage in a large venue. And the idea of being able to do micro and macro, I think, is going to be very interesting from a performance basis.
Bjork Digital is the project. And could you tell our audience a little bit about that and how it came about even?
Yeah, so I first started working with her. First started working with Bjork 2000. It was 2013. We started discussing ideas around 360 cinema, which is some people call 360 cinema VR, cinematic VR, virtual reality. And we were lucky enough at the end of her show at the Museum of Modern Art in New York to be in a position to film and playback a performance she made of her track Stone Milker. Stone Milker was one of the songs off her album Vulnicura, which is the last studio album she's released. And she basically got onto a beach with an experimental camera, a 360 camera, with her director Andy Wang, and very punk rock of her, really, no artifice beyond this camera device, and placed it on the beach where she'd actually originally come up with the idea of the song. And Andy and the producer there just basically pressed play, record, and ran off behind the rocks because there's nowhere to hide in 360. And she performed the song, and she did multiple takes and turned it into this very moving and still one of my favorite pieces, Stone Milker, where the individual splits into two and then to three, and then you have these multiple personas of her sort of literally dancing around you, pacing around you and singing to you. And we did a spatial audio mix with a bunch of clever guys I know from the BBC who were working in binaural audio for radio, which was also able to create the illusion of her audio and her voice moving around you in this 360. So that singular project of Stone Milker then really got her interest, and she started developing a plan to create a virtual reality piece to accompany each of her songs on this Vulnicura album. And so Bjork Digital kind of grew out of the MoMA exhibit, an interest in VR, but also joining together her previous technological ambition, which is the album Biophilia. It was one of the very first app-based albums. You're still able to download.
Yeah, that's great.
So each song has got an app. And then we also connected the cinema. So there's also a cinematic element to this where we show sort of 30 years worth of Bjork videos in a standard sort of 5.1 cinema space. And slowly but surely this idea sort of gained momentum. And what happened was last year in Sydney, as part of the Vivid Festival, which is this sort of art and entertainment and technology festival happens every year in Sydney, Australia, we launched Bjork Digital. And we had, at the time, we only had two virtual reality experiences. We had the Stone Milker experience that she'd made, and we also had a piece called Not Get, which is by the directors Warren Dupreez and Nick Thornton-Jones. And as each city on the tour has kind of evoked itself, so we went from Sydney to Tokyo, and then we went from Tokyo to London to Somerset House, and then we went to Montreal to the Phi Centre, and then we went to Reykjavik, back to her country of origin, obviously. Each time we've gone to a new city, she added another piece. So in the process of the tour, she was also working with directors and digital artists and producers to develop these immersive narratives around the Vulnicura album. So this has become a piece of work that's kind of evolved and then physically manifested itself to the fans and visitors around the world as she's moved it around the planet, which I think is a very illuminated way of trying to engage a young and a modern and a technically advanced audience to the opportunities afforded by these new mediums. You know?
I love what you've done because Bjork, because there's a lot of sheep dip innovation or sheep dip VR, like where you get brands just doing it because it's the thing that everybody's doing. But you with your agency and your projects have actually used them in the right sense, in the right way. And like Bjork has always pushed the boundaries with music, now she's pushing the boundaries with you with music engagement, I suppose. And as you said, with an audience who understands that now, instead of, you know, the way maybe 5 years ago somebody might do something, or they might go, oh, we need to be on social media at a board meeting, and then everybody reacts and they go, oh, we need to be on everything, we need to be on Bebo and we need to be on Twitter, and it's a crap experience. There's nobody standing up and going, hey, wait a second, why are we doing this? And I love that, like, from reading about you and the work you do, you uncover a reason first and then you go and build it.
Yeah, I agree, because I think that the philosophy of why, just that simple question, should be asked often in life. I mean, generally, you know. And I think from an artist's point of view, the work comes first. And I think the extravagance and extrapolation of technology should always be seen as an assistance to telling the story, not replacing the story. And definitely that's been Bjork's proviso. It's never been purely for tech's sake. In some ways, she's quite an interesting character through the fact that there's a appreciation and an excitement about technology, but there's also a line that gets drawn whereby there has to be an antidote to that. So there's a physical manifest. There's a reclaiming of a natural language and a natural execution. One of the reasons I know she works with Andrew Thomas Wang, his official title, the director, is because Andrew doesn't just work in CGI as a director, which was very en vogue. He also makes physical models and goes to actual locations and is very visceral in the way he works with an artist to create the visual representation of their music. And I think it's interesting because it's also sort of synonymous with the whole problems with the Star Wars prequels. You know, they were all too CGI, too much green screen. The actors couldn't relate to the narrative. It was all too conceptual. And then there was obviously now the reboot has come back to making props and putting actors in, monster suits and having actual physical connection with things. And I think that's a very interesting tale of our times. Is technology has kind of run amok, and we've gone as far as we can. And then there's come a point where I think almost like the choke chain effect, where we've had to then step back and go, okay, well, we've removed all these things and replaced them. Maybe we need to put some of the original ways of storytelling back into the mix.
Yeah, it's so true. And I think that's, you hear a lot about storytelling and brands telling a better story, etc. And that's why I think, like, because without the story, these are all just touch points now. I often think of what you said there about, Bjork is like the core thing is the story or the music. The actual original form is still the core thing. It's just like a slice. It's like a pie chart. It's just actually been fragmented lots of more ways that you reach people with.
Yeah, I think my mother, God rest her soul, was always very humorous with me, because I was into synthesizers and making music with, computers very early on, and I was a nerd. I was basically, a boy who played keyboards and in bands, but she always said to me, Andrew, always have up your sleeve the capacity to play something when the electricity gets turned off, which is a great lesson to me, because the analog of what I do as a musician, as a pianist, I ended up playing harmonium and glockenspiel and I even badly play the acoustic guitar. But that campfire moment, the realpolitik of a musician is not just having the artifice of synthesizers and computers and augmented this and this and the other. There's also the physical requirement to connect with a wobbling air in a maybe with a piece of wood and some string and some resonance. So I don't forget those things. I think those are good. It's a good bedrock to always keep it real, but to use technology when it does actually add and not just for its own sake.
Yeah, and you've touched on something there. So keeping it real, but actually going to where it's going. So let's glimpse a little bit into the future, because you've obviously. You've been close to Magic Leap. You've been close to the cutting edge. You're working in the cutting edge of where VRA or M or everything is going. So, what do you see from a human perspective? Some immediate next steps, I suppose, from using these technologies.
I think it's going to be interesting because of my own affliction with wanting to understand a broad consensus of things is it's very obvious to me that computers are the way we communicate with the electronics and the way we now communicate to each other. The means of doing that is quite old-fashioned. A keyboard and a mouse. Doug Engelbart, very famously, amazing man, Doug Engelbart. If you don't know him, you should Google him. He did a great video in 1968 at Stanford called The Mother of All Demos. And in that, Doug Engelbart, who invented the computer mouse, also showcased the very first sort of desktop-based computer interfaces with trash cans and files and folders. And that symbolic language we've ended up using to make our communication with computers easier. The keyboard and mouse and the screen, these things are now 60, almost 70 years out of date. And we're on the cusp of a revolution whereby I think we've gone to voice. So we now have Siri and we have Google Now. We have these voice recognition systems, and we have computers that speak to us. We have some layers of machine intelligence trying to understand what it was saying with Alexa and those kind of things. And then I think we also have gestures. And now, my PlayStation with my 6-year-old son, it's got a camera on it. And when I sit in front of it, it tries to track my face and see which player is playing. It's doing that through facial recognition. And I think gestures, obviously you're going into the world of being able to use gestures. I mean, the ultimate gesture device has been the iPhone and the revolution of having touch screens. And then the final sort of element to that, the final upgrade, I think, is going to be the way we visualize data. So a lot of companies anybody who's making an operating system, so the big companies like Apple and Google and Microsoft, they are all fascinated by how we're going to use their operating systems. And their operating systems are going to be addressed through voice and gesture. And the final difference will be, I think, these display systems that will be worn on the eyes. So I think virtual reality is one thing, but with virtual reality, you're cocooned in a specific environment, and it's hazardous to your health because you unfortunately have a propensity to bump into things because you can't necessarily see your actual environment. But these new mixed reality environments, I think, is going to be the real revolution. And I think we're on the cusp of these big companies launching glasses, and to greater or lesser degrees, they're going to hopefully look a lot like normal spectacles, because I think people won't necessarily want to adopt them if they look too much like they're from too far from the future, or they look like F-15 fighter pilots. But I think these glasses are going to make a difference to the way we perceive information and we communicate. And I think from a musical point of view, to get back into the flow of that, as an artist, I think you're going to be able to create a virtual version of yourself and a hologram of yourself. It's very en vogue at the moment. Everybody's making holograms of themselves. And so you make a 3D embodiment of yourself. You create an articulated model. And this thing is going to be able to materialize, and it's going to be able to come into my contemporary space. And I think this is where the third space theory is quite interesting. I mean, I originally played around with that name because at first it was actually just a joke around NASA and ESA. And I thought, well, if the first space agency was NASA and the second space agency was ESA, well, I'm going to be the third space agency. I'm going to transmit people and things into this new ethereal realm of, what I saw at the time was Second Life, but I could easily imagine being, a new way of communicating. But then if you actually go into third space theory, which is it's kind of like it's actually kind of a bit of a Marxist idea, which is this idea of a symbolic and object-based environment where sort of an ontological difference in how we perceive and respond to each other is created. I see the world of the future getting away from desktops, getting away from apps and screens, and getting away from information from a textual sort of HTML World Wide Web version, and into probably, in some ways, almost like an imminent, kind of almost quasi-spiritual thing where I think there'll be objects. And I think objects, there's a thing called the sort of ontology of objects, an ontology object-based sort of framework, where you have the significance of something in front of you and it's loaded with meaning. And we do that every day of our lives, the fact that we see these objects around us, whether they're religious or manifest logos or designs like, Coke bottles or whatever. But I think what's going to be really fascinating with these on-eye devices is, connected with the cloud, whatever that is, connected with ourselves collectively. I think the way information is depicted, and the way entertainment is consumed, and the way conversations like you and I are having is manifested, is going to change profoundly, because once you can fool the brain and the eye into mixing a digital narrative with your contextual, physical environment, that's really going to change the game, I think, profoundly.
Yeah, it's funny because you hear of VR, for example, being used to treat, post-traumatic stress disorder and various types of mental illnesses, and you can see it. Like, I mean, if you think of stuff like visualization. So I remember once there was a test done between groups of players. One, they were shooting hoops, basically playing basketball, and there was ones who visualized before they shot the hoops. There was ones that visualized but didn't actually practice at all. And then there were some that just shot hoops. And the ones that visualized and shot outscored everyone else when they came down to the competition. And that dawned on me that, I mean, using this technology and mixing it with real world narrative, or even implanting almost thoughts or experiences, can lead, like you say, to tricking the brain into believing it's done something. I find that so interesting of what's that going to open up in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting, as you say. My son is 6 years old, Arlo, and I use one of those 360 cameras you can buy from Amazon, one of those 360 Ricoh cameras, to take some pictures of me and him. And we were throwing, balls at each other and playing games, and I was taking pictures. And I just thought, how interesting to be him, because I had these bubble photographs, and now you can do bubble video, these 360 bubbles. And I thought, how interesting to be him, because by the time he gets to my age, instead of just my memories of my childhood are littered with some photo albums my mother left behind, and some, she used to give wisecrack remarks underneath these pictures of me in my shorts and going to school and stuff. With him, though, he's going to be able to inhabit a 360 bubble memory of me being him, me being with him. And how does that affect memory? And how does that affect your sense of self? Because if your entire life is trapped to a point where you're able, almost Matrix style, to jump into a memory and to relive that moment, then that's very interesting, because that's non-linearity, and memories are quite, we experience our lives in a linear fashion, and but it feels to me like the linearity of things is being atomized, and all that's changing. And I think also, again, one of the other artists I'm working with at the moment is a lady called Marina Abramovich, a very famous performance artist, and Marina is very interested in what is presence, and what is what am I, where I'm in this space. And we've had these conversations about holograms and performance art and physicality. Her art form is very physical, very demonstrably present, and she is also toying around with these ideas of what is the future going to hold if we're, as an artist, talking to an audience. If I'm not physically there, but there's light, there's photonics, there's photons of me, and there's a sound of me, and it looks to all intents and purposes like I'm there. How does that change people's perception and response to who I am and what I'm doing? I think these questions aren't new, though. I think they're newish, but I think it must have been just as profound to pick up a telephone for the very first time and to listen to another voice that was considerable distance away speaking to you. I think that must have had a profound effect on our consciousness. And I think it's the same for television. I think the first time somebody was able to transmit a picture from one space to another, and for you to be able to watch that on a two-dimensional screen, that must have been just as profound. And I feel that 100 years have passed since, the real popularization of things like recording devices, like, the radiogram and the telephone, and then later in the 20s and 30s, 30s television. It feels to me like we're on the cusp of something quite, it's probably as profound a shift as those things were, because it felt to me like the 20th century accelerated at a crazy rate. And I think that was as a result of the communications technology we developed at that time. And I feel that we are just the legacy, we're holding the legacy of that in our hands and saying, well, it was 2-dimensional, it was stereo. Now it's going to be 4-dimensional, 5-dimensional, and it's going to be 360. You know, and it feels to me a natural progression, not an unnatural one.
Yeah,
really.
That's really interesting. I was just thinking of something maybe to wrap it up, Andrew. I was thinking about Arlo, right? So you mentioned how interesting it is for him. So if we fast forward to him, and you know, hopefully he's on the beach with his son, with your grandson. Yeah. What do you think will have changed? What will he be looking back on? Progressions. If you could name just a few things that you think will happen in that period of time.
I think it'll be fascinating to see how knowledge is acquired and how relationship. I think the fundamental human thing of communicating is the thing that we love and use technology for the most. So from SMS, you know, I love that old story about SMS on mobile phones. A bunch of engineers threw SMS in as a feature they only used to test phones, and then suddenly it became this thing we couldn't live without, you know, because we all want to communicate. And it's the same with things like Skype calls and ironically, you know, even things like podcasts and the radio is still surmounting a lot of other elements and media because the radio is still something you can do whilst doing other things. Oh, sorry, my phone is going off.
No worries, man. SMS hears you, man. The phone hears
you.
Exactly.
But I think in my son, if I was to picture my son. And to what extent he will be affected by what's going on at the moment. I think computers are disappearing. I think the big boxy, you know, originally room scale, then desktop size, now in the palm of your hand, getting smaller and smaller. I think the cloud is changing the way computers work to the point where we will eventually not really see them. There won't be any physical beyond maybe an earpiece or maybe even something physically augmenting your body. I think computers will disappear in a greater or lesser degree. I think Gene Roddenberry's ideas of Star Trek, where there's just a voice, there will be just this voice with you, which is very interesting because it's kind of almost kind of Old Testament, you know, the idea of this voice speaking to you and having knowledge. And I think my son will be in a position where, as he thinks of things and as he wants to communicate, he will have a profound ability to fold space-time and distance, and he will have a profound ability to call upon the hive mind and the collective consciousness of pretty much, I imagine, everybody on the planet at some point. There will. I mean, it's all right talking about singularities and Kurzweil and stuff, but I do think the way we learn, the way we communicate, will be the two most profoundly changed things by these new technological innovations.
Brilliant, man. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and you're so well placed. You are one of the guys on the avant-garde of this revolution, and in music in particular, which is obviously your original love. It's great to see, Andrew. And where can people find you to follow you on Twitter, etc.?
Well, I tweet at the moment under von Melchior, which is a sign of my guilty German past, VONMEL. VONMELCHIOR. My website is thirdspace.co. I mean, you know, I tend to lurk and to write under those guises, so they can check out what I'm thinking about doing there.
Well, brilliant, man. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Andrew Melchior, CEO and founder of thirdspace.co. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Aidan.